Welcome, everyone, to this session of almost everything you ever wanted to know about building labs in Microsoft Azure. I am very proud and honored to be presenting in the MVP Days for January of 2018. My name is Mike Nelson. I am a cloud architect at Zerto. I've also been honored with industry awards such as Microsoft MVP in Cloud and Datacenter. I am a Microsoft Azure Advisor, a Citrix Technology Professional, and a VMware vExpert. As you can reach me at mike@nelmediaconsulting.com. Please be sure to also post your questions, comments to the Facebook and Twitter feed for the MVP Days. What are we going to be talking about today? We're going to be talking about the Azure DevTest Labs. We're going to be talking about everything that goes into the labs, how you configure a lab from the basics to the advanced, and all the other little tips and tricks that you can use when you're creating labs for yourself or for others. So what do you say? Let's go. So before we go any further, I do want to kind of talk about, something you may have already noticed is I'm a little bit more of an unconventional type of trainer. And I sometimes think that when you script things too much, you kind of lose a lot in the translation. So some of the things that I teach about, I really like to be more free-flowing, unscripted, and just, try and dig down as deep as possible and have some fun. So I'm hoping that this type of training helps you out. And I hope you enjoy, the session that we have today. And again, I'm always available on Twitter for any comments or questions that you have. So as you can see here, we're inside of the Azure Dashboard. Now, this may not look like the same dashboard you see, obviously, because it's customized for me, but this is, the general dashboard where you get all of your resources, and then on the left-hand side, you have what's called your favorites. Now, one of the things I do want to talk about is obviously the subscription. So the reason why I want to talk about that is because it's really important when you're dealing with the resources inside of Azure. Now, DevTest Labs is considered a resource. And when resources are created inside of Azure, most of the time, not all the time, but most of the time, they inherit the permissions of the subscription themselves. Okay, so there are one or two or maybe three things in features and applications inside of Azure that don't inherit the rights for specific purposes, but everything else pretty much inherits those rights. So if I have a subscription, and I'll show you what it looks like. If I go into one of my subscriptions here, you can actually see under the access control that you have users that are defined by default inside of your subscription. Now, you have owners. Obviously, those are the people that created the subscription or someone that you have assigned as an owner to that subscription. You also have other accounts. You may have, like I have, an OMS automation account, which is like a service principal. It's like a service account if you want to think of it that way. But then I also have a reader account on the bottom, which only has access to read things. It only reads, my usage data and provides it back to clouding. So, this is kind of important to remember because a lot of these things that are created at the subscription level are inherited down to the resource level. So when we look at the DevTest Labs, you're going to see these, same accounts show up. Okay, important to remember. So now we'll hop right over to the DevTest Labs. As you can see here, in my DevTest Labs, I've got two labs that have already been created, Project Aqua and Project Magenta. Now, in this screen, I want to highlight one thing. One thing is about subscriptions. So I have, if you notice up at the top, I have all 5 selected. Okay, you may have 1 subscription, you may have 5, you may have 10, you may have 100. I don't know that. But what I do know is that when you start creating resources in Azure, you want to be very careful about where you put those resources and what subscriptions. Okay, and the reason for that is because subscriptions, number one, have limits. All right, so you can only create so many cores and so many CPUs and so many gigs of RAM and so many storage IOPS inside of a subscription. Okay, so you start piling everything into there. Pretty soon you're going to get a message saying, "Oh, no, you can't do that anymore. You've hit your limit." You can ask for extensions. You can ask for expansions, if you will, to your subscription, which are usually granted on a very limited basis, but you can still, expand them if you need to. The other thing is that you want to be cognizant of organizational, issues when you start kind of sprawling out with all these different subscriptions and where you're putting stuff. So in my mind, I try and keep everything, together that deals with a specific topic or a project or something like that. And it's a good habit to get into when you're creating resources inside of Azure. Again, it's more of an organizational thing. You have your own way of doing things. That's cool. Just that's how I do it. So what I'm going to do here is I'm actually going to go out and I'm going to create a lab. And the reason why I'm doing this is because I want to show you how simple it really is. Inside of a lab, you basically give it a name. Okay, I'm going to call this one Project Ivory. And you give it a subscription, like I just mentioned. And then you also give it a location. Now, one of the things about the locations I want to point out, actually two things I want to point out. Number one is you want to be cognizant of what location you're picking for the reason of what resources are going to be available to you. What you need to understand is that Azure doesn't always have the same resources in the same regional locations. So something that you have available in US West may not be available in North Central US. It may not be available in South India. It all depends. Now, Azure usually with preview and newer stuff, they isolate that so they can kind of contain it if something goes wrong or they have to redeploy it or something like that. But all in all, most things are spread out across, 90% of the regions. There are some that just, don't have the capabilities, or the region isn't large enough, to be honest. The other thing you want to take into account is obviously who is going to be using your labs. So where are they located? Okay. The reason why I say that is because I'm in the Midwest. If I create a lab in North Central US, yeah, that makes sense, right? Because it's going to be really fast for me. I'll be able to access things really quickly, have almost no latency, and be able to cruise right along. But then you have folks that I'm going to build a lab, and maybe the people that are going to be utilizing it or building the application for that lab are going to be located in another part of the world. And does it make a lot of sense to have them come all the way over to where I am? No, not really. Okay, so you want to be aware of where the users are going to be using this lab. Now, obviously, if you have users that are going to come in from all over the world, then you want to hit one of the big, regional centers like US West, US East, US West 1, US East 2, US East 1, any of those big ones, you want to make sure that, it gets to the cores, right? But otherwise, you want to put it closer to the users. That just kind of makes sense and, makes a user experience much better for them. The last thing when you're building a lab, okay, is something auto shutdown. Now, when you create an auto shutdown policy, this actually governs the whole lab. Okay, so if I say I want to shut down at 7 p.m. on Central Time, okay, that'll actually shut down the entire lab. Now with auto shutdown, okay, which we'll get into a little bit later with Autostart, is that auto shutdown is done on a global basis. You have to opt out VMs out of auto shutdown. Otherwise, if you enable this policy right here, it'll shut everything down. Okay. One thing to note here is that you can get a notification before the auto shutdown in case you want to, jump in and say, no, I don't want it to shut down. Or you have a CMDB or a service test system that you want to generate a ticket. You can use a webhook URL to do that as well. And finally, what we have here are tags. Now, if you haven't used tags, I highly encourage you to take a look at them because they really are beneficial. In my opinion, they're really beneficial. I know that some folks think, it's not, but I really think it is. And if you use them, I think you'll find them. It will make your life a lot easier. What tags basically do is they take a resource or they take a group of resources and they assign a tag to it, some term to it. Okay. Now, what's really beneficial about this is that, number one, when you create something that's a parent resource, like a dev test lab, all of the children underneath that, all the child resources underneath that get the same tag. Okay. So as an example, if I were to put a name in here, a project number, and then a value of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, then everything that I create inside of this lab will have that tag assigned to it. Now think of how easy that would be to understand your utilization, your billing, your chargeback, or whatever you could do with that information. When you bring up those analytics reports and those log reports, you'd be able to really sift through that information a lot easier. I find it is very beneficial because I deal with a lot of folks that create labs for people that are not part of their organization. that are outsourcing, either development or QA, testing, load testing, things like that. When they do that, they need a way to reconcile all the resources that are used by those folks, right? And the consumption that they use. So tags makes that really easy. All right. So take a look at them, definitely give them a shot if you haven't already. The big thing to remember here is that when you create the tags at this level, like I said, it's the parent. It applies to all the children. All right. You can go in and create tags on individual resource objects like a virtual machine, but that's not going to be like, applying back to the parent. It doesn't inherit up, it only inherits down. All right. So if I were to go in and just hit create here, it'll go out and create this lab after a few minutes, and it'll come up and tell me create here, and we'll let it do its thing. So before we move on, let's talk about this automation options over here on the right. Now, if you talk about automation options, when you click on here, it's going to open up a JSON template and the parameters file for what you've just created. And what that does is it allows you to create an ARM template or a PowerShell script or an Azure CLI script to go ahead and automate the creation of this resource. So if you have to create multiple resources, such as multiple labs, I highly recommend you take a look and invest in learning about creating ARM templates, PowerShell CLI automation, and use these templates to automate the creation of 2, 3, 4, 5, 10, 20, 100 labs or other resources that you use in Azure. It really is beneficial. And while that's doing that, I'll actually go back and take a look at one of the other projects that I've already created, which is Project Aqua. Now, when you open up a dev test lab, okay, you actually get an overview screen, just like any other resource inside of Azure. You take a look at it, it gives you the essentials, all that information. But then the pane below that gives you all the resource specific information, like this one has my virtual machines and claimable virtual machines. All right. So I'm going to get into that in a little bit. I want to first jump to the very important part when you're setting up any lab is around the access control, because you're going to want to give people access to this. Now, you may want to give a person access to this to just turn it over to them and say, go ahead, build a lab for whatever purpose. You might be the sysadmin that just creates it, the shell of the lab, and then you turn it over to someone else. The configuration and policies is actually everything that you can do from the highest level for the lab. Okay. And the first thing I want to jump to is I'm going to go back to these other options, but one thing I want to go to right away is access control or identity access management, IAM. Now, what you'll notice is that this is pretty much the same blade that you saw when we had the subscriptions open, right? It is the same blade, actually, and it actually can be used in multiple resources, so you'll see it in a lot of places. But what this does is this allows you to add users, right? And one thing I want to point out, obviously, is remember those 4 users that I already had on my subscription level? Well, look at here, they're inherited, okay? So I can go in there and I can remove these people from this dev test lab if I'd like to. You'll actually see all the roles that are available for you to use. And then if you click on the little information circle, it'll tell you what that role can do. And then it'll also tell you how many users are currently assigned to that role and how many groups are assigned to that role. Now, when I talk about groups, I'm talking about actually, Azure Active Directory groups. So if I want to go in and just add a user, okay, to my lab, I click on the add button. And the first thing it asks me is about selecting a role. All right, so if I select a role, say I want to be a Dev Test Labs user, then it's going to say assign access to. Now, you'll notice that it focuses on the Azure Active Directory user groups or applications. This is a little misleading because you can actually give external users access to your lab as well, people that are outside of your Azure Active Directory, outside of your organization, like a contracted developer or tester or documenter or what have you. If you wanted to, select someone that's already in your AD, just scroll through the groups here, and the users and click and you've selected your folks. But if you want to add an external user, you would just click inside of the select field, enter the email address. Okay. Now the email address has to be the Microsoft ID email address. There has to be a Microsoft ID. Okay. They won't allow you just to throw any email address out there. They have to have a Microsoft account. And it'll come up and it'll tell you that the user that you've entered is an external user, and it'll send an email with the instructions on how to access your lab, which is really convenient. Now, one thing to remember is that all users who access resources inside of Azure must have an Azure subscription. And that means that they must have a free subscription, pay as you go, possibly assigned by an EA administrator, but they must have some kind of subscription in order to use or access any resources inside of Azure. So from a user perspective, that's how you would set up the access control. And I hope that's you understand that how that all works. And when you start setting up users, it'll get easier as you go along. Now, while we're in the configuration and policies, I want to show you like the initial cost tracking, cost by resource. This is going to tell you, what your actual lab is costing you, what the trends are. It'll tell you how much each virtual machine is going to cost you, all that kind of stuff. This is really helpful where tags come in, because then you can, tag your information and combine it with other labs or other resources in Azure that these people may be using or you may be using or what have you. But this gives you a general tracking of your costs. Under the settings, you'll notice a couple of options here. And again, you're setting this for the entire lab, right? So allowed virtual machine sizes. In Azure, you have VMs, and these VMs are created by size. So you have to select the size in order to, instigate a creation of a deployment of a VM. So when you select a size, you're selecting the number of cores, the memory, even so far as to go down to the number of IOPS that are allowed, the disks that are allowed, all that kind of stuff. If you enable this, it'll give you checkboxes that you can actually click on, for each individual one. So I want to allow that, I want to allow that one, and that one, and that's it. Usually I set this so it's dependent on what the actual lab is being used for. And what the users are going to be allowed to create, which I'll get to here in a second. So if we get back to the virtual machines per user, this is where you can set the number of machines that a user can have inside of their, use of the lab. And you can also set the number of machines that use SSD disks. And then when you get down to virtual machines per lab, this is a total number of virtual machines inside of the lab itself. You can restrict that. If you're the type of administrator, or you have the project where you just turn this over to another person and they take care of it, you may want to restrict this on the top level and say, okay, I only want you to be able to create 10 VMs, and that's it. All right. And I'm not going to let you create any that have SSD disks because I want to control those costs. This is where you would set that up. Clicking on the lab settings, you can see that it's the setting for configuring access rights for the lab users on the environment resource group. So the entire resource group has a permission setting for default users. And right now it's set to reader. You can change that to contributor if you'd like. From a lab announcement and the internal support, these are new items that were just recently added. Now, lab announcement obviously is like a message of the day that'll pop up for users. And the internal support is for you to put like a help desk URL, telephone number, or email address. And the schedules of AutoShutdown and AutoStart. Now, we've talked about AutoShutdown, right? Let me focus right on AutoStart. When you talk about AutoStart, we talked about being able to automatically start up the resources. All right. But one thing you have to remember is, like I mentioned before, auto start and auto shutdown are just like the opposites of each other in terms of one gets automatically applied to all resources and one does not. So in auto start, it does not automatically apply to any virtual machines in the lab. You have to opt in. The key here, auto shutdown, you have to opt out. Auto start, you have to opt in. External resources. Repositories are kind of important because they contain different material like code, artifacts, things like that that you can use inside of your lab. And the only way you can get those artifacts into the lab is via a repo, a repository. So you need to set up like a GitHub repository, a Visual Studio repository, a Git repository, some kind of repository that you can put that information into so you can bring it into your lab. Virtual networks. I'm not going to get too heavy into virtual networks. We could be here for a couple of hours talking about networking. I'm not going to do that. Basically, it's just like setting up an infrastructure inside of Azure. You define your virtual networks and put them all together with all of your firewall rules and everything else. It's kind of elaborate, but most folks, I would probably say, half the labs that I've created in Azure, I've had to go in and actually create custom virtual networks so they can talk, back to local networks, or they can talk to another network in Azure, and so on and so forth. Let's take a look at Marketplace images. Now, Marketplace images, everybody's familiar with the Azure Marketplace. Marketplace images are all the disk images or the OS images that you can load, okay, that are provided in a repository. The Marketplace is actually a repository by Microsoft. These are images of Windows, Linux, vendor images, all kinds of images. Now, one thing to note here is that when you talk about Marketplace images, you may not see the same images that you're looking at here, or your users may not see the same images that you see. And the reason for that is because there are certain limitations placed on the type of subscription you have. Have a Visual Studio, which was formerly called MSDN, subscription in order to see the Windows, okay, the Windows Server, the Windows client images. All right, to see those, you have to have that subscription. When you're dealing with different images, you have what here it's called offer status. That's actually standard terms, and then there's terms needed, review needed. This really is more around licensing. Okay, so you have your standard terms, which is pretty much, your Microsoft EULA or your GPL or your open source kind of standard verbiage and standard use terms for that image. But then you have terms review needed is really, hey, you've got to have a license that you bought from us in order to use this, or you have to have this license on premises in order to use this up in Azure type of a deal. You need to look through those if those are any of the images that you need to use. So you can limit these. Obviously, if you click yes here, you can go ahead and check mark the images that they're allowed, the users are allowed to create virtual machines off of. That's when we start getting into custom images. Custom images are going to be the ones that you can actually load, okay, into Azure that your users can use inside of the lab. So you can use a client, you can use a portal, you can use a client, you can use an SFTP, you can use however you can get images into your Azure storage space. You would be able to upload that VHD file, your custom image, and then allow that to be used by your users inside of your lab. So anything custom that you create on premises, you can load it up, and then the users will get the same image. Now, if you don't have custom images and you don't want to use Marketplace images as kind of like, the generic image that you can use, you can actually create a formula. Okay, formulas are called reusable bases. That's exactly what they are. The ability to reuse, okay, a base image throughout your labs, not only in one lab, but multiple labs if you'd like. I'm going to step through this real quick. So when you actually go through, you're going to pick a base. I'm going to pick one off the bat here, a CentOS base. And then this is where you can actually go through and customize that base. Okay, you can do it with passwords, disk size, the virtual machine size, like I mentioned before. But one of the things I do want to point out here is something called artifacts. Now, this is really kind of cool. This is where you can actually add an artifact to an image after the fact, after it's deployed. Okay, so you deploy the image, or the user deploys that image, and then Azure automatically goes back and installs or adds, this artifact to it. Okay, so I have a Linux image and I want to add Docker to it. If I click here, it'll automatically get deployed with a post-deployment routine for Docker. All right, which is really kind of cool. It saves you some steps, right? You can actually add your own artifacts. That's where these repos come in. That's where you need your own repo, because you can create your own artifacts, your own installable artifacts, put them into a repo, and then you'd be able to add them here as part of a formula. The last thing I want to show you is the advanced settings. So on the advanced settings, that's when we start getting into the more networking options. So one of the really cool things I want to point out here is the automatic delete option. Okay, so you can set an expiration date on your lab, which is, really kind of cool when you think about it. You can go through and you can say, okay, I've got this lab and I only need it until this date. Okay, so when this date hits, delete it. Then I don't have to worry about it anymore. I don't have to worry about it consuming resources, and I know it's gone. It's really kind of a neat option when you're dealing with labs that, you may not be participating in. Then you also have things like claim options. This is where it makes it actual claimable, right? In the machine, like we showed in the overview screen, it'll show up as a machine that a user can claim. And then you can set the number of instances. So I wanted to create more than one. You can create, 5, 10, 15, 20, how many you want to create. You just put that number in there. The activity log is just like any other resource in Azure as well. It basically tells you what you've done inside of here. Now, what's really cool about this is you can export it and you can bring it right into Log Analytics. If you haven't checked out Log Analytics, I highly recommend it. But you can take all these and you can download them to a CSV. You can export them into Log Analytics. You can eventually bring them into Power BI if you'd like to be able to analyze them even further. The properties of the lab, basically the subscription ID, stuff like that. One of the things I do want to point out here is something called the Change Resource Group. That wasn't there not too long ago. So this is new, or newer, I should say. And what you can do is you can actually change the resource group that this lab is in, which is really kind of cool. Now, I caution you on this. Okay, only using it if you really, really have to. The reason is because I have seen some parts or portions or resources of the labs that don't carry over into the other resource group very well, especially if there are existing resources in that resource group, if you're bringing into a resource group that already has resources. So I caution you on that. If you don't have to change it, then I always am like, leave well enough alone. So, but it's there if you need it. So the last thing that I really want to cover here is I do want to cover something that is down here called My Secrets. Now, the reason why I want to cover My Secrets is because it's really kind of a neat feature that allows you to create a vault, if you will, for keys, tokens, passwords, etc., that you can implement into the lab and the users don't even have to know about them. Okay, so if they go ahead and build a virtual machine, you can tell them to use a secret called administrator password, and they'll be able to use that, but they'll never know what that password is. Okay, because they can set up their own user in that machine and use it by themselves. So it's really kind of cool. And the users can have their own secrets. So they can have their own little vault. If they're doing things in your labs, they can create their own as well. So that's really kind of a neat feature that you can check out. Finally, we have something called the data disks. Now, I don't want you to get confused with this being custom disks. All right, because custom disks are the actual, the VHD, the boot. My data disk is really focused around, the D, E, and maybe F drives that you put onto a virtual machine. It's more around, maybe a database that resides on the D drive, or an application that can ride by itself on the E drive. These are disks that you can add to a virtual machine, or your users can add to a virtual machine when they need to, use that functionality or whatever is in that machine, that disk to use. So that's where we're going to wrap it up for today. Hopefully I covered everything that you wanted to see. There's a lot more that you can do inside of the DevTest Labs that I just can't fit into the 30-minute time frame. But I hope you enjoyed the training. I hope you learned something from it. And again, please give us your feedback on the Facebook page and the Twitter feed for the MVP Days. Thank you so much and have a fantastic day.